It was just a portrait of a plantation owner and her slave, until experts noticed a forbidden secret. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood at the receiving dock of the National Archives in Washington, D.C., signing for a package that had arrived with no return address. It was a Tuesday morning in March 2024, unseasonably cold, and she had been curator of the Civil War photographic collection for 12 years. In that time, she had received hundreds of donations, daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, cartes de visite, each one a window into America's most turbulent period. But something about this package immediately caught her attention. The box was small, carefully wrapped in brown paper with only her name and the archive's address written in neat block letters. No phone number, no email, just a brief typed note tucked inside. Dr. Mitchell, this photograph has been in my possession for 30 years. I inherited it from an estate sale in Charleston, South Carolina. I believe it may be historically significant, but I do not wish to be identified. Please examine it carefully. Some things are not what they appear. The truth matters more than my name. Sarah felt a familiar spark of curiosity. Anonymous donations were unusual, but not unheard of. Sometimes people inherited items with troubling histories and wanted them properly archived without personal involvement. She carefully lifted the photograph from its protective wrapping. It was a carte de visite, a small mounted photograph popular during the Civil War era, roughly the size of a modern business card, in remarkably good condition for its age. The image showed two people posed in a formal studio setting with a painted backdrop of classical columns and elegant draping. On the left stood a white woman approximately 28 to 30 years old, wearing an elaborate silk dress with a wide hoop skirt, fitted bodice, and delicate lace collar typical of wealthy Southern women in the early 1860s. Her hair was styled in the fashion of the period, parted in the middle and pulled back smoothly. She stood with confident posture, one hand resting on an ornate side table, her expression serene and composed. Her clothing and bearing communicated wealth, status, and the assured confidence of someone accustomed to authority. On the right stood a black woman, noticeably younger, perhaps 22 to 24 years old, wearing a simple but well-made dress of dark fabric with a plain white collar. Her hair was covered with a white head wrap, typical for enslaved domestic workers. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her posture upright, but with shoulders slightly curved inward. Her expression was carefully neutral, eyes cast slightly downward in the deferential manner expected of enslaved people when being photographed with their enslavers. The composition was typical of Civil War-era photographs, intended to document the benevolent relationship between enslavers and the enslaved. Propaganda images meant to justify the institution of slavery by portraying it as a paternalistic system where enslaved people were well cared for and content. Sarah had seen dozens of similar photographs. They always made her deeply uncomfortable. Visual documents of oppression staged to look like harmony. She turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded ink, was a notation: Caroline Ashford and her girl Rachel, Charleston, South Carolina, March 1863. Just those few words. No last name for Rachel. No indication of relationship beyond the possessive, her girl. This was standard for the period. Enslaved people were rarely granted the dignity of full names or identities in official records. Sarah set the photograph on her examination table under proper archival lighting and reached for her professional loupe. Something about the anonymous donor's note troubled her. Some things are not what they appear. What had the donor seen that prompted such a cryptic message? She began her standard examination protocol, looking for signs of damage, alteration, or unusual details. The photograph appeared authentic, the right paper stock, mounting style, and printing technique for 1863. No obvious signs of manipulation or forgery. But as Sarah examined the faces more closely through her magnifying loupe, something began to nag at her professional instincts. Something she couldn't quite identify yet, but that made her lean closer, her pulse quickening with the familiar sensation of a significant discovery waiting to be made. She picked up her phone and called her colleague, Dr. James Warren, who specialized in forensic analysis of historical photographs. "James, can you come to my office? I need a second opinion on something." "Give me 10 minutes, he replied. Sarah returned her attention to the photograph, to those two faces separated by the brutal hierarchy of 1863 Charleston. Caroline Ashford, plantation mistress. Rachel, whose last name had been considered unworthy of recording. But something about those faces was beginning to disturb Sarah in ways she couldn't yet articulate. She reached for her digital scanner, knowing she needed to examine this image at far higher resolution than her loupe allowed. Whatever the anonymous donor had seen, Sarah was determined to find it. Dr. James Warren arrived with his portable digital microscope and laptop, the specialized equipment that had helped them authenticate and analyze countless historical photographs. He was in his mid-40s, methodical and precise, with the patient demeanor of someone who understood that historical truth often revealed itself slowly, detail by detail. "What do we have?" he asked, setting up his equipment on Sarah's workstation. Sarah handed him the photograph and the anonymous note. 1863 carte de visite from Charleston, plantation mistress and her enslaved domestic worker. Standard propaganda composition for the period, but the donor specifically said to examine it carefully, that things aren't what they appear. James studied the image through Sarah's loupe first, his expression neutral and professional. Then he looked up, meeting her eyes. "Have you noticed the facial structure?" Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "I was beginning to... Yes, but I wanted your analysis before I said anything." James connected his digital microscope to his laptop and positioned the photograph under its lens. The image appeared on the screen, and he began systematically examining it at increasing magnifications, starting with the overall composition before focusing on specific details. "Let's start with basic facial mapping," he said, opening specialized software used by forensic analysts to compare facial features. He began marking key points on Caroline Ashford's face: the distance between her eyes, the width of her nose, the angle of her cheekbones, the shape of her jaw, the positioning of her ears relative to her eyes. Then he moved to Rachel's face and began marking the same measurement points. Sarah watched the screen as the software generated overlay comparisons. Even before the analysis was complete, the similarities were becoming undeniable. "The interocular distance is nearly identical," James said quietly, his voice taking on the focused intensity he always had when making a significant discovery. "Same ratio of face width to face length, nearly identical cheekbone structure. Look at the jawline, the angle is the same. And here, the shape of the ears, the way they sit relative to the eyes, that's genetically determined and remarkably similar." He pulled back to show both faces side by side on the screen, with the measurement overlays visible. "Sarah, these two women share significant facial structure similarities, more than would be expected from random chance." Sarah leaned closer to the screen, her mind racing through the implications. "Familial relationship?" "Almost certainly," James confirmed. "The degree of similarity in this many facial features strongly suggests they share close genetic heritage. Sisters? Possibly. Or mother and daughter, though the age difference looks too small for that." Sarah felt a chill run through her. She had studied enough about the antebellum South to know exactly what this likely meant. White plantation owners routinely raped enslaved women. The children born from that violence were themselves enslaved, half-siblings, to the white children of the household, but treated as property rather than family. "If they're sisters," Sarah said slowly, "that means Caroline Ashford's father raped an enslaved woman," James finished grimly, "and then enslaved his own daughter. It wasn't uncommon. Historians estimate that a significant percentage of enslaved people in the antebellum South had white ancestry, usually through rape by enslavers. But to have photographic evidence this clear, with facial structure this similar, this is extraordinary documentation." Sarah stood and walked to her window, looking out at the Washington traffic below, trying to process what they were uncovering. The anonymous donor knew. That's why they said things aren't what they appear. This photograph wasn't just propaganda about the supposed benevolence of slavery. It's documentation of a white woman enslaving her own half-sister. "We need more evidence before we can make that claim definitively," James cautioned. "Facial similarity is suggestive, but not conclusive. We need historical records, birth records, plantation documents, family genealogies, and ideally, if we can find living descendants, DNA analysis would be definitive." Sarah turned back to the photograph on the screen. The note mentioned an estate sale in Charleston 30 years ago in 1994. If this photograph came from the Ashford family estate, there might be other documents, letters, plantation records, family Bibles. "We need to find out everything we can about Caroline Ashford and her family." James nodded, already typing notes into his laptop. "I'll start with Charleston historical records. The Ashford name should be well documented. Wealthy plantation families kept extensive records. And if Caroline lived past the Civil War, there will be census records, property documents, possibly even newspaper mentions." "What about Rachel?" Sarah asked. "Will we find anything about her?" James' expression was somber. "That will be much harder. Enslaved people rarely appear in records under their own names before emancipation. But if she survived the war and lived into the Reconstruction period, there might be census records, Freedmen's Bureau documents, possibly church records if she was literate and active in the black community." Sarah returned to her desk and carefully photographed the carte de visite from multiple angles with her high-resolution camera, creating a complete digital archive. Then she turned the photograph over and photographed the notation on the back. "Caroline Ashford and her girl Rachel," she read aloud. "Not even her servant or her maid, just her girl." The possessive language is so casual, so complete. "That was the point," James said. "The language reinforced the property relationship. Enslaved people weren't people. They were possessions, like furniture or livestock." Sarah began searching historical databases, while James continued his forensic analysis of the photograph. The Ashford name appeared immediately in Charleston records. A prominent family, wealthy plantation owners, who had been in South Carolina since the early 1700s. "Found something," Sarah said. "Robert Ashford, plantation owner, born 1798, died 1865. He owned Ashford Grove Plantation, approximately 3,000 acres, with over 200 enslaved people. He had one legitimate daughter, Caroline Ashford, born 1834. She married Thomas Pemberton in 1856, but was widowed in 1862, when he died fighting for the Confederacy. She returned to her father's plantation, which is where she would have been in 1863 when this photograph was taken. So Caroline was about 28 or 29 in this photograph," James confirmed. "That matches the apparent age. What about siblings?" Brothers or sisters? No legitimate siblings listed, Sarah said. Caroline was an only child, at least officially. The word officially hung heavy in the air between them. They both knew what it meant. Robert Ashford may have had only one legitimate white child, but he almost certainly had other children. Children born to enslaved women, children who were never acknowledged, never given his name, never granted their inheritance or freedom. Children like Rachel. For the next week, Sarah and James worked with obsessive focus, methodically building a documentary case about the Ashford family. They requested records from the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, the Charleston County Public Library's historical collection, and several university archives that held Civil War-era plantation documents. The Ashford family's history unfolded in meticulous detail. Robert Ashford had inherited the plantation from his father in 1825 and expanded it significantly, making a fortune from rice cultivation using enslaved labor. He was prominent in Charleston society, served in the state legislature, and was a vocal defender of slavery in the years leading up to the Civil War. His daughter Caroline had been educated at an expensive finishing school, married well to Thomas Pemberton, a rice factor from a similarly wealthy family, and had lived in Charleston proper until her husband's death at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862. "Look at this," James said, pulling up a digitized plantation record from 1850. "This is an inventory of Ashford's enslaved people, required for tax purposes. Over 150 people listed, including their approximate ages and assigned work. And here, a woman named Sarah, age 23, listed as a house servant." Sarah leaned over his shoulder to read the faded handwriting. In the clinical language of property inventory, human beings were reduced to entries in a ledger, names, ages, monetary values, work assignments. If Sarah was 23 in 1850, Sarah calculated, she would have been about 37 in 1863, old enough to be Rachel's mother. "Keep going through the list," James said. "See if there are any children associated with Sarah." Sarah scrolled down the document. The enslaved people were listed in family groups when possible, though these families could be separated and sold at any time. Under Sarah's entry, there was a notation. "One child, female, age 3, name Rachel." "There," Sarah breathed. "Rachel, age 3 in 1850. That would make her about 16 or 17 in 1863. She looked up at James. "That's younger than she appears in the photograph." Enslaved people's ages in these records were often approximate, James explained. Enslavers didn't always keep accurate records of enslaved people's births, and harsh living conditions, malnutrition, and hard labor often made enslaved people appear older than their actual age. They continued searching through plantation records, building a timeline of Rachel's life as it appeared in the sparse documentary record. She was listed in subsequent tax inventories in 1855 and 1860, always as Sarah's daughter, always assigned to housework rather than field labor. Then they found something that made Sarah's blood run cold. It was a plantation ledger from 1855, documenting the distribution of new clothing to enslaved workers. Most entries were routine. Men received 2 shirts and 1 pair of pants annually. Women received 2 dresses and 1 head covering. But there was a handwritten notation in the margin next to Rachel's name. "Give extra fabric this year. Master's orders. The girl looks like family. Keep her in-house, away from visitors." "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. They knew. Robert Ashford knew Rachel looked like his legitimate family, and he specifically ordered her kept hidden from outside visitors who might notice the resemblance. James was already photographing the document with his camera. This is direct documentary evidence that Rachel's appearance was unusual enough to warrant special attention. Combined with the facial structure analysis, this strongly suggests she was Robert Ashford's biological daughter. Sarah felt rage building in her chest, not the hot, impulsive anger of the moment, but the cold, sustained fury that came from documenting historical injustice in precise detail. Robert Ashford had raped an enslaved woman named Sarah. When their daughter Rachel was born, he enslaved his own child. And as Rachel grew, and her resemblance to his white daughter Caroline became more apparent, he deliberately hid her away, knowing that her face revealed his crime. "We need to find out what happened to Sarah," Sarah said. "Rachel's mother, is she listed in later records?" James pulled up the 1860 tax inventory. He scrolled through the names, then stopped. "Here, Sarah, age 33, house servant. But look at the notation. Written next to Sarah's entry in different ink, as if added later. Deceased, September 1860. No cause listed." Sarah was 33 years old when she died, and the record didn't even bother to document how or why. She had simply ceased to exist as far as the plantation's bookkeeping was concerned. "So Rachel lost her mother in 1860? Sarah said quietly. "She would have been about 13 years old, and then she was left alone in that house, enslaved by her own father and half-sister." They continued their research, finding more pieces of Rachel's life scattered through fragmentary records. She appeared in Caroline's personal diary. James had located a transcribed version in a university archive, but only as the girl Rachel, or my maid. Caroline mentioned her casually, the way someone might mention a useful household object. One entry from January 1863 was particularly chilling. Father insists I have my portrait made with Rachel before he passes. He says it will show that our family treats our people with Christian kindness. I suppose he is right, though I find the whole affair tiresome. Rachel will need a decent dress for the photograph. I shall have my old blue silk altered to fit her. The photograph was Robert Ashford's idea, James said. He was dying. He died in March 1865, according to the records, and he wanted to create a visual record that portrayed his enslavement of his own daughter as an act of kindness. Sarah stared at the transcribed diary entry. Caroline had written about posing with her half-sister for a propaganda photograph with the same bored tone she might use to describe any tedious social obligation. There was no indication she understood or cared about the profound injustice of the situation. "We need to find descendants," Sarah said. Both Caroline's white descendants and Rachel's descendants, if she had children. DNA analysis could definitively prove they were sisters. "Oh, and if we can prove it," James added, "this photograph becomes something extraordinary. Documented evidence of one of slavery's most hidden crimes, the enslavement of one's own children." While James continued searching for genealogical records, Sarah returned to the photograph itself. The anonymous donor's note kept echoing in her mind. "Please examine it carefully. Some things are not what they appear." They had found the facial similarity, the historical records documenting Rachel's presence in the Ashford household, even Caroline's diary entry about the photograph session. But Sarah had the persistent feeling there was something else, some additional detail hidden in the image itself. She set up her professional scanner, a high-end flatbed model capable of capturing resolution far beyond what the human eye could perceive, and carefully positioned the carte de visite. The scanning process took nearly 30 minutes at maximum settings, creating a digital file so large it required specialized software to open and examine. When the scan was complete, Sarah loaded it onto her large monitor and began the painstaking process of examining every millimeter of the image at extreme magnification. She started with the background, the painted studio backdrop, the floor, the ornate side table where Caroline rested her hand. Nothing unusual there. Standard studio props of the period. She moved to the clothing, examining the fabric textures, the buttons, the lace details on Caroline's collar. Then she focused on Caroline's jewelry, a small brooch at her collar, a simple ring on her right hand visible where it rested on the table. Then Sarah moved to Rachel's side of the image, the simple dark dress, the white collar, the head wrap. Rachel's hands were clasped in front of her waist, fingers interlaced in a pose that appeared purely formal. But as Sarah increased the magnification to the maximum the scan allowed, something caught her eye. Rachel's hands weren't simply clasped. They were positioned very deliberately, and she was holding something between her palms, something small, mostly hidden by the careful positioning of her fingers, but partially visible if you knew to look for it. Sarah's heart began to race. She adjusted the contrast and brightness, bringing out details that had been lost in shadow for 161 years. It was paper, a small piece of folded paper no more than 2 inches square, clutched between Rachel's palms and deliberately concealed from casual observation. "James," Sarah called out, her voice tight with excitement, "you need to see this." James came to her side, and she showed him what she'd found. At normal viewing size, Rachel's hands appeared to be simply folded in the standard pose of a servant. But at extreme magnification, the hidden paper was undeniable. "She was holding something during the photograph session," James said, wonder in his voice. "Something she deliberately hid from the photographer and from Caroline. Something small enough to conceal in her clasped hands. The question is, what was written on that paper?" Sarah said. "And more importantly, does it still exist?" James pulled up the anonymous donor's note on his phone and read it again. "Please examine it carefully. Some things are not what they appear." "The donor knew about the paper," he said. "That's what they wanted you to find, which means they might have the paper itself," Sarah finished. "They might have found it with the photograph." She looked at the small, partially visible corner of paper hidden in Rachel's hands 161 years ago. What had been so important that Rachel risked hiding it in a photograph that would be carefully examined and preserved by the family that enslaved her? "We need to find the donor," Sarah said. The package had been sent from a postal facility in Charleston, South Carolina, but with no return address and no identifying information. Sarah contacted the Postal Service, but without a warrant or criminal investigation, they couldn't provide sender information. She tried a different approach. The anonymous note had mentioned acquiring the photograph from an estate sale in Charleston 30 years ago, in 1994. Sarah reached out to her contacts at the Charleston Historical Society and began searching for records of estate sales from that period that might have involved the Ashford or Pemberton family. It took 3 days of phone calls and database searches, but finally she found something promising. In June 1994, the estate of Margaret Pemberton Thornton had been liquidated at auction in Charleston. Margaret had died at age 98, the last surviving direct descendant of Caroline Ashford Pemberton. Sarah obtained a copy of the estate sale catalog. It listed hundreds of items: furniture, silver, paintings, books, and notably, miscellaneous historical documents and photographs, various dates, approximately 150 items in total, sold as single lot. "That's it," James said when Sarah showed him the catalog entry. The photograph must have been part of that lot. Someone bought it in 1994 and held on to it for 30 years before sending it to you. But why? Sarah wondered. Why keep it for 3 decades and then suddenly donate it anonymously now? She posted carefully worded inquiries on genealogy forums and historical society message boards, asking if anyone had information about items purchased from the Thornton estate sale in 1994. She was careful not to reveal what they had discovered, simply stating that she was trying to trace the provenance of a donated photograph. A week passed with no responses. Then, on a Monday morning, Sarah received an email from an address that consisted only of random numbers and letters. Clearly a temporary account created specifically for this communication. Dr. Mitchell, I am the person who sent you the photograph. I have been following your research career for several years and believed you would give this artifact the serious investigation it deserves. I purchased a box of Ashford family papers and photographs at the estate sale in 1994. I was a graduate student in history at the time, interested in Civil War-era material culture. When I examined the contents, I found the photograph you now have, along with other items I believe you should see. I have waited until now to come forward because Margaret Thornton's children and grandchildren were still alive and prominent in Charleston society. I did not want to cause pain to living people who were not responsible for their ancestors' actions, but the last of them died 6 months ago. It is time for the truth to be known. If you wish to see the other materials from the estate sale, I will make arrangements to meet with you in Charleston. I still prefer to remain anonymous for personal reasons, but I will provide you with everything I have. Reply to this email if you are interested. Sarah read the message 3 times, her mind racing. The anonymous donor had more materials, potentially more evidence about Rachel and the Ashford family. Perhaps even an explanation for what Rachel had been holding in her clasped hands during the photograph session. She looked at James, who had been reading over her shoulder. I have to go to Charleston. We both do, he said. If there are additional documents, we'll need to authenticate them and create a complete archive. Sarah replied to the email immediately. I am very interested in examining any additional materials you possess. When and where would you like to meet? I can travel to Charleston at your convenience. Thank you for entrusting this important historical evidence to the archives. Dr. Sarah Mitchell. The response came within an hour. Saturday, 2 p.m. at the Charleston Archives and History Center, 161 Meeting Street. Ask for a private examination room. I will deliver the materials to you there. I will not stay. I will simply drop off a box and leave. Please examine everything carefully. The truth about Rachel is more extraordinary than you yet realize. And yes, the paper she was holding in the photograph is included in the materials. Sarah felt chills run down her spine. The paper Rachel had hidden 161 years ago still existed. Whatever Rachel had been desperate enough to conceal during that photograph session, whatever truth she had tried to preserve while being forced to pose as her half-sister's contented slave, Sarah was about to discover it. Sarah and James flew to Charleston on Friday evening and checked into a hotel near the historic district. Neither of them slept well. The anticipation of what they might discover the next day made rest impossible. At 1:45 p.m. on Saturday, they arrived at the Charleston Archives and History Center, a modern building that housed one of the finest collections of low-country historical materials in the South. Sarah had reserved a private examination room, a climate-controlled space with proper archival handling equipment, designed for researchers working with fragile historical documents. They waited, making small talk to distract themselves from their nervousness. At exactly 2 p.m., there was a knock on the examination room door. Sarah opened it to find a staff member holding a cardboard box. This was just dropped off at the front desk for Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the young woman said. The person who delivered it didn't give a name, just said you were expecting it. Did you see who dropped it off? Sarah asked. An older person, maybe 60s or 70s, wearing a hat and sunglasses. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, honestly. They were only at the desk for about 30 seconds. Just set the box down, said it was for you, and left. Sarah took the box. It was heavier than she expected, and thanked the staff member. She closed the door and set the box on the examination table, her hands trembling slightly. Let's see what we have, James said, pulling on archival gloves. Sarah did the same, then carefully opened the box. Inside were multiple items, each wrapped in acid-free tissue paper and carefully labeled with handwritten notes on index cards. The first item was a leather-bound diary, cracked with age. The label read, Caroline Ashford, Pemberton's personal diary, 1862, 1867, complete and unedited. Note entries marked with red tabs. The second item was a bundle of letters tied with string. The label read, Correspondence between Caroline Ashford Pemberton and her cousin Anne Middleton, 1863 to 1865. Note letter dated April 1863. The third item was a small Bible, its leather cover worn smooth. The label read, Family Bible from Ashford Grove Plantation. Check the births and deaths page, handwritten entries. And finally, wrapped in multiple layers of tissue paper, was a small folded piece of yellowed paper, brittle with age. The label read simply, This is what Rachel was holding. Rate it first. Sarah and James looked at each other. With trembling hands, Sarah carefully unfolded the fragile paper, supporting it on a clean piece of archival mat board to prevent it from tearing. The paper had been folded very small, small enough to hide in clasped hands, but when fully opened, it was approximately 4 inches square. The edges were torn, suggesting it had been ripped from a larger document. Written on it, in careful, precise handwriting that had faded to brown with age, were these words: "I, Robert Ashford, being of sound mind, do hereby acknowledge that Rachel, daughter of Sarah, is my natural daughter, born of my body, and is kin by blood to my legitimate daughter Caroline. This is written in my own hand as true witness. God forgive me for the evil I have done. April 7th, 1863. Below the text was a signature, Robert Ashford. The room went absolutely silent. It's a confession, James whispered. A written, signed confession that Rachel was his daughter. Sarah stared at the paper, trying to process the implications. He wrote this in April 1863, just a month after the photograph was taken. He was dying. The records show he died 2 years later. This was his deathbed confession. But why would he write it? James asked. He had kept Rachel enslaved her entire life. Why confess now? Guilt, maybe, Sarah said. Or fear of divine judgment. He was dying, and perhaps he wanted some record of the truth to exist, even if he never publicly acknowledged it. But how did Rachel get it? James wondered. This is written in Robert Ashford's hand, probably in his private study. How did an enslaved young woman get access to her enslaver's signed confession? Sarah carefully photographed the document from multiple angles before responding. That's what we need to find out. Let's look at the other materials. Sarah carefully opened Caroline's diary to the first page marked with a red tab. The entry was dated March 15th, 1863. Father is dying. The doctor says his heart is failing and he has perhaps 6 months remaining. He has become maudlin and speaks constantly of his sins and fears of judgment. This morning he asked me to bring the girl Rachel to his study, which I found peculiar as he has never taken particular interest in her before. They spoke privately for nearly an hour. When Rachel emerged, her face was strange. I cannot describe it. Not quite tears, but something profound. Father would not tell me what they discussed. He only said that he had made his peace with something that had long troubled him. The next marked entry was dated April 10th, 1863. Something extraordinary and troubling has occurred. 3 days ago, Father called me to his study and confessed something that has shaken the foundation of my understanding. He told me that the girl Rachel is not merely our servant, but my half-sister. That her mother Sarah was his, I cannot even write the word. He said he had written a document acknowledging this fact and had given it to Rachel herself, telling her she was his daughter and asking her forgiveness. I was horrified. I asked him if he intended to free Rachel, to acknowledge her publicly. He said he had not the courage for that, but that he wished her to know the truth privately and to have his written word as proof should she ever need it. He asked me to treat her with more kindness, as she was my sister. I do not know what to think or feel. My world has turned upside down. Sarah felt her throat tighten as she read. Caroline had known. After the photograph was taken, she had learned that Rachel was her half-sister, and Robert Ashford had given Rachel his written confession directly. The next marked entry was dated June 2nd, 1863. I'm trying to fulfill Father's wish to treat Rachel with more kindness, but I find it difficult. The habits of a lifetime are not easily broken. She is still a Negro, still a servant, regardless of whose daughter she may be. Today I asked her if she still possessed Father's paper, the one acknowledging her parentage. She said she kept it hidden and safe. I asked where. She would not tell me. I was angry at first. How dare a servant refuse to answer me? But then I remembered that she is also my sister, and perhaps she has reason not to trust me with such information. Father died last month. The paper is all she has of him, the only acknowledgement she ever received of her true identity. I suppose I cannot blame her for guarding it carefully. James was reading over Sarah's shoulder. So, Rachel kept the confession hidden somewhere, and when the photograph was taken in March, she concealed it in her hands, right under Caroline's nose. It was an act of defiance, Sarah said. Maybe the only act of defiance she could safely make. She couldn't speak the truth. She couldn't publicly claim her identity. But she could hide the proof of it in a photograph that was meant to show her as a contented slave. She was literally holding the evidence that everything in that photograph was a lie. They continued through the diary, reading entry after entry that documented the strange, twisted relationship between the two half-sisters. Caroline never freed Rachel. She continued to treat her as a servant, even while acknowledging privately that they shared a father. The cognitive dissonance in the diary entries was striking. Caroline writing about my sister Rachel in one sentence and my maid in the next, never quite able to reconcile the contradiction. Then they found the entry that changed everything. It was dated December 28th, 1865. Rachel has left. She simply walked away 3 days ago and has not returned. She waited until the war was fully over, until the Abolition Amendment was ratified and there could be no question of her freedom. Then she took her few belongings, and Father's paper, I am certain, and departed without a word. I should be angry, I suppose, but I find I am not. I am relieved. Her presence was a constant reminder of Father's sin and my own complicity in her enslavement. Perhaps now I can forget and move forward with my life. I wonder if I shall ever see her again. I wonder if she will ever forgive any of us. She escaped, James said, relief evident in his voice. Rachel survived the war and walked away when she knew she was legally free. And she took the confession with her, Sarah added. That paper was her proof of identity, her connection to her father, her evidence of the truth. She kept it her whole life, probably. They turned to the bundle of letters next, finding the one marked April 1863, correspondence between Caroline and her cousin Anne Middleton. Caroline had written to her cousin shortly after learning about Rachel's parentage. Dearest Anne, I must confide in you a terrible secret that has been revealed to me. Father has confessed that the girl Rachel, who has been in our household since she was born, is actually his daughter by one of our slaves. She is my half-sister, Anne. My sister. And I have treated her as a servant her entire life. I do not know how to rectify this. Father gave her a paper acknowledging her parentage. But what good is a paper when she remains enslaved? Yet I cannot free her. The scandal would destroy our family's reputation, and I would be shunned by society. So I do nothing, and I feel the weight of my cowardice every day. Tell no one of this. It must remain secret until I am in my grave. Your troubled cousin, Caroline. The final item in the box was the family Bible from Ashford Grove Plantation. These Bibles were common in wealthy families. Large, leather-bound volumes where births, marriages, and deaths were recorded in handwriting on special pages at the front and back of the book. Sarah carefully opened the fragile Bible to the records page. The entries were in multiple hands, written over decades. The first entries dated back to the 1790s, recording the births of Robert Ashford's parents and grandparents. Then came Robert Ashford's own birth in 1798, his marriage to Elizabeth Middleton in 1830, and the birth of his daughter Caroline in 1834. But there was another entry, added in different ink and clearly written much later. It was squeezed into the margin of the page, as if someone had been trying to add it without being noticed. Rachel, daughter of Robert Ashford and Sarah, born 1847, sister to Caroline. The handwriting was shaky but determined, and at the bottom of the page there was a note in the same hand. This entry was made by me, Rachel Ashford, on December 20th, 1865, before I departed this place forever. I add my name to this family record because I am family, whether acknowledged or not. I was born here. I lived here as a slave for 18 years. My father was Robert Ashford. My sister is Caroline. These facts are true, whether written in this Bible or not, but now they are written, and anyone who reads this will know. Rachel. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes. Rachel had claimed her place in the family record. Before walking away from the plantation, where she had been enslaved by her own family, she had written herself into their Bible, asserting her identity and her right to be remembered. She documented herself, James said quietly. She made sure there was a record, even if no one acknowledged it during her lifetime. They spent the next several hours carefully examining and photographing every document. Each piece added another layer to Rachel's story. The diary showed that Caroline knew the truth, but chose comfort and social acceptance over justice. The letters showed that other family members had been told the secret, but had agreed to keep it hidden. The confession showed that Robert Ashford had known exactly what he was doing, enslaving his own daughter, and had felt guilt, but not enough to actually free her. And the Bible showed that Rachel had fought back in the only way available to her, by documenting the truth, by claiming her identity in writing, by refusing to be erased. We need to find out what happened to her after she left, Sarah said. Where did she go? Did she have children? Are there descendants? James was already searching on his laptop. Freedmen's Bureau records, post-war census data, church registries. If Rachel lived anywhere in the South after 1865, there should be some trace. It took 3 days of intensive searching, but they finally found her. In the 1870 census for Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, there was an entry for Rachel Ashford, age 23, Negro literate, occupation seamstress. She had kept her father's name, and she had survived. Over the following days, Sarah and James traced Rachel's life forward through census records and city directories. She had lived in Philadelphia for over 40 years, working as a seamstress, and later as a teacher in a school for black children. She had married in 1872 to a man named Joseph Freeman, a carpenter and Union Army veteran. They had 3 children: Robert, named after her father, perhaps as an act of reclamation; Sarah, named after her mother; and Caroline, named after her sister, suggesting Rachel had somehow made peace with that complicated relationship. Rachel Freeman had died in 1912 at the age of 65, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Her death certificate listed her parents as Robert Ashford and Sarah. Even at the end of her life, she had claimed her full identity. 4 months after receiving the anonymous package, Sarah successfully traced living descendants from both Rachel and Caroline's family lines. From Rachel's side, James Freeman, a retired teacher in Baltimore, and his sister, Dr. Patricia Freeman Johnson, a physician in Atlanta. From Caroline's side, Elizabeth Pemberton Harrison, an attorney in Charleston, and her brother Michael Pemberton, a business consultant in Virginia. The black descendants responded with emotional validation. James Freeman revealed that family stories had always told of an ancestor enslaved by her own white father, but they thought it was exaggerated legend. Learning that Rachel's confession paper, the Bible entry, and all documentation were real brought tears and relief. Rachel deserves to have her truth confirmed by science, he said, immediately agreeing to DNA testing. Patricia Freeman Johnson expressed similar feelings, noting their family always knew of white ancestry through rape, but never knew the full horror of a father enslaving his own daughter. The white descendants initially resisted. Elizabeth Pemberton Harrison refused to believe her family could have committed such acts, calling the research absurd and threatening legal action. However, her brother Michael responded differently, admitting he had always suspected dark secrets in their family history and agreeing to face the truth, whatever it revealed. DNA testing conclusively proved that Rachel and Caroline were half-sisters, sharing the same father. The results were irrefutable. Genetic markers showed a sibling relationship with 99.9% certainty across multiple testing companies. Sarah organized a press conference at the National Archives, displaying the 1863 photograph alongside the forensic facial analysis, Robert Ashford's written confession, Caroline's diary entries, and the family Bible with Rachel's handwritten claim to her identity. The story went viral immediately, covered by major news outlets worldwide. Elizabeth Pemberton Harrison eventually faced the evidence and issued a public statement acknowledging her ancestors' crimes and apologizing to Rachel's descendants. The two families met privately, a deeply emotional encounter where they examined the photograph together. Seeing Rachel holding her father's confession in her clasped hands, her act of silent resistance preserved for 161 years. The photograph became the centerpiece of a permanent Smithsonian exhibit titled Hidden in Plain Sight, Rachel's Testimony. Rachel's descendants finally had irrefutable proof of what their grandmother had always told them. The respectable Ashford-Pemberton legacy was permanently rewritten to include the truth. A father who enslaved his own daughter and a young woman who refused to be erased, documenting her existence so that someday someone would finally bear witness.